Welcome to Divcasts from University of Chicago Divinity School. For more of our podcasts and information about our terms of use, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts.
Hello, I'm Joseph Stern. I direct the Center for Jewish Studies, and I'm not going to welcome you to the conference, Maimonides, the history of the translation and interpretation of the guide. That doesn't mean that you're unwelcome. I'm simply deferring all of the welcoming remarks until the session this evening. So let me hand the podium over directly to Michael Sells, who will chair this first session on critical evaluation of pieces of language.
Thank you, everybody. It's a privilege to be here, and thank you to James and Joseph for all the work they've done. It's my privilege to introduce the first panelist, Siriatim. So my first introduction will be to Professor Stephen Harvey of Bar-Ilan University. And each of our speakers will speak for approximately 30 minutes. I have a card here that has a 5 and a 1. If it gets close to the end of that I can wave, and I'll be sitting in front. After the three expositions, we'll have questions among the panelists first, and then with all of you, and discussion. There'll be a break in between at some reasonable point, and we should be finished by 5. So without further ado, Professor Harvey.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here in Chicago, together with so many learned scholars, Maimonides thought, at this conference marking the 50th anniversary of Venus's translation of the guide at the University by the University of Chicago Press. I'm grateful to Joseph Stern and the organizing committee for putting together such a rich and promising session. But for the moment, as for our first section, which is the interest of the evaluation of Venus's translation of the guide 50 years later, I must say I'm very much looking forward to this session, because I can think of no men of knowledge, men, women of knowledge, more qualified to evaluate the translation than Professors Stroumsa and Ivry. In my own remarks, I would like to focus on Venus's translation of technical terms. Does Venus's translation allow us to penetrate the figurative language of the guide and apprehend its inner sense?
Excuse me, Steve, does everyone have a handout?
Yes, the handout has not been handed out. The handout may help you understand my opening remarks that I just said. As many of you are aware, over the past decade, several learned scholars have independently of each other considered retranslating the guide into English, and some of them have even written detailed proposals explaining why a new translation is needed. By the end of my lecture, I will explain my own thinking on the need for a new translation. Among the arguments repeatedly made for an urgent need for a new translation, urgent because the guide is the most important theological, philosophical Jewish book of the medieval period, are the following. The translation is wooden. The translator's commitment to remain as close as is practical to the original text of Maimonides has rendered the translation far too literal and rather cumbersome. The translation is overly ambiguous. The translator's explicit desire to preserve the ambiguity and obscurity of the original text makes it unnecessarily obscure and difficult to understand. The translation is misleading. The translator's insistence on translating every technical term by one and the same English term invariably leads to misunderstanding. The translation is in need of correction. It is widely believed that it contains many inaccuracies that distort the meaning of the text and make it difficult to follow. These faults, among others, it's not necessarily my opinion that these are faults, as we will see, but these faults, among others, it is claimed, make the guide a much less accessible book than it needs to be. These difficulties are further compounded by the fact that the translator was not a native speaker of English. It was perhaps his fourth or fifth or sixth language, and the belief that his understanding of the guide was at times obfuscated by his Straussian interpretations of the text. These voices of critique call into question the readability and reliability of the Penis translation, and many scholars of the guide today, including some in this room, would agree that some amount of revision and correction to the translation is indeed urgently needed. What is interesting is that 50 years ago, when the translation was first published, it was repeatedly greeted with high praise and sincere gratitude, often for the very same reasons for which scholars criticize it today. For example, Isidore Twersky wrote in his review in Speculum that this thoughtful translation should be used for careful study and not casual reading. Its advance over the existing English translation of M. Friedlander is not in its overall intelligibility, which is often deceptive, but in literalist accuracy, in the attempt to capture the heartbeat of the original Maimonidean text, its rhythms and disorders, its shouts and silences, its ambiguities and obscurities. In general, the translator may be seen as following the steps of Shmuel ibn Tibon, the first translator of the guide into Hebrew, who strenuously strove for fidelity of rendition rather than felicity of presentation. In a similar vein, Alexander Altman, in his review of this, quote, truly magnificent edition of a New English rendering of the guide, suggests that in contrast to the previous English translation, that of Penis provides the precision necessary to convey the exact meaning and flavor of the text. Altman adds that the translation will help toward a clearer understanding of the complex nature of Maimonides' philosophy. For another example, Marvin Fox, in his review, praises the Penis translation for finally making the guide accessible and intelligible to the English, or for that matter, Western reader. Fox explains, no translation can ever be a fully adequate substitute for the original text, but Professor Penis's rendition of Maimonides' guide comes as close to the same as anyone could hope. Fox explains that Penis has managed to be remarkably faithful to Maimonides. He has succeeded admirably in his stated goal to remain as close as practical to the original. Penis's translation reproduces Maimonides' obscurity and ambiguity. Penis sought accuracy and achieved it in this splendid translation. No other translation of the guide meets Penis's standard of precision and consistency. Translators of other great works would do well to imitate Penis's method and strive to meet his very high standards. Lawrence Berman, a learned Arabist and critic of editions and translations of Arabic philosophical works, has only high praise for Penis's translation, calling it extremely important, and he refers to Fox's, quote, valuable review for a detailed evaluation. One could, of course, argue that even if we accept the high praise of the reviews of the translation some 50 years ago, time has passed. Our knowledge and understanding of Maimonides have greatly increased, and Penis's English, even with the editorial services of Ralph Lerner that gave the translation an English style that reflects Maimonides' subtle prose, is becoming out of date. Yet a quick look at Amazon.com shows about 20 reviews in recent years of the penis translation, and all but one give it 5 stars, the highest 5 stars highest reading, describing the translation with terms such as excellent, unsurpassed, incomparable, wonderful, and clear. Moreover, although we hear of the difficulty of using Penis's translation in the college classroom, I have never encountered such problems. This is not to say that the text is an easy read, but the translation makes possible the careful study of the guide in English. How good is Penis's translation? I would like to explore the question from one perspective, his translation of technical terms and his stated goal that as far as compatible with intelligibility, every Arabic technical term has been rendered by one and the same English term. Does Penis actually do this? Does he choose fit and accurate English terms? Are these terms still appropriate today, 50 years later? And does this pedantic policy not lead inevitably to confusion and misunderstanding, as the present-day critics claim? Univocal, equivocal, and different name terms. If you have the handout, you'll see each of the sort of subtitles is reflected in the handout. Let's begin at the beginning with one of the first terms that confused the reader of Penis's translation. What is an amphibolious term? Maimonides begins his introduction to part 1 of the guide by explaining that his first purpose in this treatise is to explain the meaning of certain biblical terms. He adds, some of these terms are equivocal, hence the ignorant attribute to them only one or some of the meanings in which the term in question is used. Others are derivative terms, hence they attribute to them only the original meaning from which the other meaning is derived. Others are amphibolious terms, so that at times they are believed to be univocal and at times equivocal. There are 4 related terms, 4 related key terms here. Univocal, and I've provided the Arabic on the handouts. Univocal, equivocal, derivative, and amphibolious. Among earlier modern translations, Monk translates the Arabic terms appellatif, conventionnel, homonyme, métaphorique, and amphibologique. Friedlander, of the same class, homonyms, figurative, and hybrid. Chaim Rabin, apparently following Monk, with conventional, homonymous, metaphorical, and ambiguous or amphibological. All these scholars realized that these terms appropriated by the Islamic philosophers were explained by Maimonides in his treatise on the art of logic. The problem is that there Maimonides divides homonyms or equivocals in the most general sense into 6 groups, including the 4 terms of the guide, plus terms used in general and in particular, and transferred terms. It may be added that although these terms appear as well in the writings of the Islamic philosophers, in particular Maimonides seems to be using the terminology of Avicenna and the Shifa categories. Their divisions and descriptions vary. But let us focus on the ism mushaka that Penis translates as an amphibolious term. The term is translated into Hebrew, as in Samuel ibn Tibon's translation of the guide, as Shem Supak, by the 3 translators of the treatise on the art of logic, Moses ibn Tibon, Achitud, and Joseph ibn Rivas. Indeed, this is the standard medieval Hebrew translation, as the root safek, like the Arabic shak, conveys the meaning of doubt. This is how Maimonides, in Ephros' translation, explains the terms in the treatise. The amphibolious term is a term applied to 2 or more objects because of something which they have in common, but which does not constitute the essence of each one of them. A quick glance at the online Glossarium Greco-Arabicum shows that the Arabic term mushaka translates the Greek amphibolous. Amphibolous literally means thrown on both sides, and thus it is often translated as ambiguous. But ambivalous itself is a proper English term and has become widely accepted translation for mushaka in a wide variety of texts. It is not only used by Pinus, Ephros, Monk, and Rabin, but also is the German translation in Klatsky's Thesaurus Philosophicus. It was made somewhat famous for Wolfson's 1938 article, The Ambivalous Terms in Aristotle, Arabic Philosophy, and Maimonides, although Wolfson himself seems to have preferred the translation ambiguous in his article. Pinus' choice of ambivalous may be a stumbling block at first for beginning readers of the guide, but it indicates that Maimonides is setting forth certain technical terms whose meaning must be learned. But the same is true for the medieval Hebrew term that translates mushaka, and thus Ibn Tibon's need to explain the term in his Perush Hamilot Hazarot. It is the relative uncommonness of ambivalous, as well as its derivation from ambivalous, the Greek word mushaka translates, that makes it such a good translation. Pinus is consistent in his translation of ambivalous from mushaka, just as he is consistent in his translation of equivocal from mushtarak, and univocal for ism b'tuatu. However, after the first page of the introduction, he employs figurative to translate musta'ak. I'm not sure why Pinus changed his translation in later passages, but figurative certainly is the preferred translation. In fact, the Islamic philosopher did speak of terms that may literally be translated as derivative, mushtaka. Unlike the figurative terms that are two different meanings of the same term, derivative terms are two different terms that are derived one from the other. Maimonides refers to such derivative terms himself in a rather important discussion of God's names in 161 to 163, and also in the context of words derived from Tzedek in 353. In all those passages, Pinus correctly translates mushtaka as derivative. God's name Shaddai derives from Dai, which means sufficiency. That's a derivative term. I will sum up now our conclusions regarding Pinus' translation of technical terms for various kinds of univocal, equivocal, and different names. Pinus' choice of terms is precise, and apart from a few seemingly misguided translations in the introduction of musta'ar as derivative, translations are consistent. In later passages, he correctly translates it as figurative and reserves derivative for mushtaka. The relatively uncommon term ambivalous, which causes some difficulty for beginning readers of the guide, proves to be a prudent choice. Technical terms. Before I consider Pinus' translation of other key technical terms, I would like to make a general statement about his translation of the central philosophical terms in the guide. With a few exceptions, Pinus accurately and consistently translates these central philosophical terms. And you have a very selective list of subterms with the Arabic of Maimonides. He clearly is very careful about his translation and his consistent employment of the same terms to translate these key philosophical terms. Terms to describe the few. Now we might well expect that any competent translator would translate these terms that you have in the handout correctly and do so consistently. But such expectations need to be qualified. For example, Western translators of the guide, including Monk, Pinus, Friedlander, Rabin, and Goodman, regularly and consistently translate Kamal correctly as perfection, but they are not also consistent with regard to Kamil, the perfect one. Pinus translates Kamil consistently as the perfect or the perfect one or perfect man, and Monk also consistently translates the term as l'homme parfait. And I might add, Ibn Tibon consistently translates the term as Hashalem. In contrast, Friedlander translates the term inconsistently as men of culture, this is the perfect man, as men of culture, men of the highest culture, one who has attained perfection, those who are capable, educated persons, rational persons, thinker, the intelligent, as well as the perfect man. This variation is striking, particularly if we consider that the term only appears about 15, 16, 17 times in the Guide of the Perplexed. Goodman and Rabin, in their abridged translation, do not have occasion to translate the term often, because they're abridged translation, and usually do translate it as the perfect man. But they also are not consistent. Rabin translates it also as one who has attained perfection and an accomplished person. Goodman translates it also as those whose understanding is most perfect and simply grown men. I do not want to suggest that any of these translations of Kamala are indefensible. But I do believe an argument can be made for translating the terms consistently and literally as the perfect man. It is well known that Maimonides often speaks of the different ranks of mankind. What if Kamala denotes such a rank? How could one know anything about this rank if one can't compare all its uses because it is translated in so many different ways? What if Maimonides was really as careful an author as he claims? Is the perfect man for him one of the men of knowledge, one of the men of speculation, philosopher or philosopher? The reader reading the guided translation can try to answer this question only if she can discern when each of these terms appears in the Arabic, and she can do so only when the terms are translated consistently and accurately. She can do so with Pinus's translation. Let's consider the expression Achla Nadar, which Pinus translates consistently as men of speculation. In the medieval period, Nadar regularly translates theoria and was regularly translated by the Hebrew translators as iyun. An appealing, quite popular English translation is speculation, reflecting the Latin speculatio, which was used to translate both the Arabic Nadar and the Greek theoria. Also popular is theoretical speculation, which preserves the Greek and Latin terms, and although a bit ungainly, clarifies that speculation in these passages does not have the modern denotation of conjecture. Pinus translates Nadar as speculation, and occasionally as theoretical speculation or philosophical speculation. In contrast, Friedlander again uses several different terms to translate Nadar, including philosophical speculation, philosophy, investigation, inquiry, thought, intelligence, reason, and contemplation. This consistency, or lack of consistency, in translating Nadar into English is, as to be expected, reflected in the translation of Achla and Nadar. Pinus translates it consistently as men of speculation, or men or people engaged in speculation. Samuel Bentivon translates it consistently as Baalei Ha'iyun. Friedlander, for his part, translates it as thinkers, intelligent persons, scholars, or philosophers. With Pinus's consistent and literal translation of Achla Nadar, a reader can try to determine for herself whether men of speculation is a technical term from Maimonides, and if so, to whom it applies. With Friedlander and other translations, where Achla Nadar is not consistently translated, this is not possible. The expression Achla Adim is accurately and consistently translated by Pinus as men of knowledge or men of science. Friedlander translates it as wise men, men of science, men, students, thinkers, and philosophers. Rabin translates it as men of learning, educated persons, scholars, the learned, and philosophers. And among the terms Goodman employs are men of understanding, thinkers, the knowledgeable, and scholars. Virtually all translators I have checked consistently translate philosopher as philosophers. The problem is that if the reader wishes to know to whom Maimonides applies the term philosopher, This will not be possible to determine through those translations, as we have seen, that also employ philosophers to translate akal nadar and akal adin and other terms. Pinus's accurate and consistent translation of these terms that seem to designate the intellectual few enabled the reader to identify each of them as technical terms, just as the reader of Maimonides' Judeo-Arabic text could do so, and try to determine which groups or ranks they represent and the possible differences between them. Thus, for example, who are the perfect ones? Are they, as we might expect, those who have attained highest perfection and reached the supreme ranks of man? We learn already from the epistle dedicatory that Maimonides believed that Joseph and Judah, at some point in his studies with him, had reached the level at which he should have the secrets of the prophetic books revealed to him, so that he could consider in them that which perfect man ought to consider. In the introduction, we learn that the degree of the perfect varied actually widely according to the image of the lightning flashes, for those who are in unceasing light, from those who are in unceasing light, to those whom flashes are in smaller or greater intervals. These perfect ones can guide others to understanding something of the secrets according to their degree of perfection. The perfect man is the one who can understand the secrets through the hints and parables in the Bible. He is the one for whom the parables are present in the prophetic books, and he is the one for whom Maimonides wrote the guide. He will comprehend and be the beneficiary of esoteric writing, while the multitude will understand what they can according to their capacity. The perfect man devoted to the law and perplexed will benefit from all the chapters of the guide. The secrets were hidden and may be glimpsed through flashes, so that the perfect man may learn them. If even the perfect man becomes too occupied with the necessities of bodily life, let alone unnecessary things, his theoretical desires will grow weak, and he will not apprehend what he could not have apprehended, what he otherwise could have apprehended. It is the perfect ones among whom are the authors of Psalms, who teach us that silence and limiting ourselves to the apprehensions of the intellect are more appropriate than meaningless speech. The perfect man will know not to listen and believe the stupid tales and books and accounts of magical names of God. He will also come to understand the importance of the intellect that overflows towards us is the bond between man and God, and when he understands this, will conduct his life accordingly. As he increases in age, his apprehension will increase. As his joy and love in his apprehension, as will his joy and love in his apprehension, as his bodily desires diminish. The perfect man who lives in solitude does not think of the multitude except to save himself from harm or to get some advantage. The internal and external. The terms Zahir and Batin are well known to students of Arabic culture and civilization. Most importantly, they refer to the external or apparent meaning of the law and the internal or concealed meaning of the law. But these terms are also used to refer to any distinction between what is manifestly apparent and visible, the outer or external, and what is concealed and hidden, the inner or internal. Maimonides uses these terms often in the guide, and they are technical terms for him, to refer to modes of biblical interpretation, as well as philosophical interpretation, and in several other quite different but related contexts. Pinus makes a conscious effort, more so than most other translators, including Ibn Tibbon, to translate these terms consistently and literally as external and internal. The first use of these terms in the guide occurs in the introduction to describe the two types of biblical interpretation, or the two meanings of the biblical text. Maimonides explains that an ignorant person might think that obscure parables have only an external sense, vaya, and not an internal one, vata. As for the one who truly possesses knowledge, who interprets the parables in their external sense, he will become perplexed. But if it is explained to him that these are parables, or when the meaning of the parables is explained, the perplexity will vanish. A bit later, Maimonides refers to the interpretation of the perfect man, Akamo, of the Midrashim. He either might take the external sense of the Midrashim and conclude that their author is an ignoramus, or you can attribute to them an inner meaning and think well of its author. Now, the parables of the prophets, like the parables of the sages, have both an external and internal meaning. The external meaning contains wisdom that is useful in many respects, among which is the welfare of human societies. Their internal meaning contains wisdom that is useful for beliefs concerned with the truth as it is. Not all biblical statements thus ought to be taken in their external sense, and if one does so, that is, does not interpret the statement according to its internal sense, then the statements may well seem to contradict each other. It is not only the ignoramus who gets confused. In Guide 149, in the context of the discussion of angels, Maimonides explains that those who do not distinguish properly between what is cognized by the intellect and what is imagined, and for whom what is not imagined cannot exist, form the majority of those who engage in speculation. The true reality of a notion never becomes clear to them. It is for them that the external sense of Scripture may be understood to signify that the angels are corporeal. In a similar way, the external sense of Scripture appears to state that God is a living, moving body having the form of man. At times, the meaning is most hidden, even when one considers the text according to its inner meaning and to what was truly intended. Maimonides illustrates this in Guide 230, a chapter with its own unique literary style, with its frequent repetition of the expression, among the things you ought to know. In his explanation of why it does not say of the second day of creation that it was good, in the explanation of why it does not say in the second day of creation that it was good, because the goodness is not clear from the external sense, with its account of firmament and waters, and very difficult to understand even according to the internal sense, it was not proper to say it was good. In Guide 146, Maimonides introduces another Ahid-Batin contrast, that of external organs and internal ones. This is in the context of which kinds of organs or bodily parts are ascribed to God. Surprisingly, Penis translates these expressions as apparent organs and hidden organs, where we would have expected him to translate them as internal or external ones, just as in this case, Monk and Friedlander did. Another use of the Ahid-Batin contrast applies to the distinction between external and internal senses. In the guide, as Wilson has pointed out, Maimonides does not use these expressions, but rather refers to Idrakat al-Isiya al-Bahira and al-Idrakat al-Batina, which Penis translates accurately as external sensory apprehensions and internal apprehensions. These are apprehensions involving the external and internal senses. Some of the former and some of the latter are attributed to God, while others are not, all in accordance with the language of the sons of man. Maimonides also employs the Ahid-Batin contrast to distinguish between outward and inner appearances. An example of an outward appearance is the cleansing, even spiritual purification of the body, while the inner side is the pursuit of desires and pleasures of the body. The person who concerns himself with the purification of the body, while having unbridled license in eating and sexual intercourse, merits the utmost blame. Maimonides explains that this goes counter to the purpose of the law, which is to restrain desire. The purification of the outer ought to come after the purification of the inner. For one last example of the Ahid-Batin contrast, in Guide 352, as we've seen, Maimonides distinguishes between outward and inner behavior or conduct of those perfect men who understand that the intellect that overflows towards us is the bond between us and God. God is thus constantly with us. As for the perfect ones who understand this, their inner conduct with their wives and in latrines will be like their outer conduct with other people. Penis here does not translate Ahid-Batin as outward and inner, but rather as public conduct and secret conduct. Actually, none of the translators we've examined are consistent throughout in translating Ahid-Batin, and most follow Monk here in translating public conduct. Does outward conduct simply not work in English? The Ahid-Batin contrast is important throughout the guide in its various contexts, and is in all these contexts related to the rank of man and how he sees and understands the world, be he among the many or the few. Venus is the most consistent of all translators, but as we have seen, he is not always consistent. Again, it is not that any of the translators are mistaken in their various translations of Zahir Batra. It is just that we have no way of knowing when these terms appear in the Arabic text, and thus the connections between them. There is also the problem of interpretation. Mordechai Cohen has recently addressed this problem in connection with the various translations of the guide of the Zahir of scriptural text. For example, as pshat or literal. These translations can be problematic, and Cohen seems to prefer Penis's rendering of it as the external sense, which often captures, he says, Maimonides' intent, especially where it is contrasted with Batin, the inner sense. Happiness. I can give one more example of Penis's consistent and accurate translation of technical terms in the guide. The term I have in mind is sa'ada, happiness, one of the most important terms in Al-Farabi and in Islamic political philosophy. Most surprisingly, it is used only rarely by Maimonides, even in passages where we would expect it to appear. I recently examined Maimonides' use of sa'ada for a lecture at the CPEM Congress in Faisal in August 2012, entitled The Perplexing Case of the Missing Happiness in Maimonides' Guide. In fact, Maimonides uses the term sa'ada in only 5 chapters of the guide, and not in those key chapters such as 327, 51, and 54 in the context of the divine law, man's attainment of apprehension of God, the intellectual worship of God, the ultimate end of man, and man's final perfection, where we most expect it to appear, as it does in similar contexts in the writings of the philosopher. Sa'ada translates Aristotle's eudaimonia, and was rather consistently translated by the medieval Hebrew translators as hatzlacha. Most modern-day Western translators of the guide I have consulted translate the term accurately, although not consistently, as happiness. Why then even discuss the term? The problem is that these same translators also use happiness to translate other terms, with quite different connotations. Friedlander translates sa'ada as happiness, prosperous, felicity, good, and on one occasion he chooses not to translate it. On the other hand, he translates at least 5 different terms as happiness. Rabin translates sa'ada as happiness, fortunes, and well-being, but also translates other terms, such as ghirta and lava, as happiness. Only Penis consistently translates sa'ada as happiness, and reserves happiness to translate sa'ada. Penis's translation thus makes possible what is not possible in other translations, a careful study of the crucially important term sa'ada from Maimonides. And only through such a study can we begin to answer the question, is true happiness possible for Maimonides? My conclusion should now be evident. Penis's decision to translate each Arabic technical term consistently with the same English term to the extent, quote, compatible with intelligibility, makes possible the careful study of the guide. It does not always make for the most eloquent or easy to understand translation, but it is the most accurate and most reliable. Reading the guide is not a simple matter, nor was it intended to be. My experience is that intelligent beginning students of Penis's translation soon understand this. It is a challenge that Emily rewards study. The great virtue of Penis's translation, even 50 years later, and despite occasional inaccuracies, is that it makes such a study possible.
Thank you very much, and I think our procedure will be just to have the 3 papers back on back, and then to have the discussion at the end of the 3 papers. So thank you for that fine and clear talk, and we move on to our next talk by Professor Alfred Ivry from New York University.
I also have a handout. I want to apologize for the handout because of its irregular appearance. Due to technical difficulties with my computer, I had to improvise with the vertical mark assigned for the superscript dots that occur with some consonants, and employed 2 vertical marks to indicate both the tashdid and the tamabuta. I hope this will be easy to adjust to, otherwise you can ignore it. There are also 1 or 2 typos I can notice in the spelling. My first familiarity with the guide in English was with the Michael Friedlander translation, sitting in class with Professor Altman while he corrected Friedlander's writings. It was a very slow class. The 1963 Penis translation appeared the year I got my doctorate from Brandeis, and it has accompanied me in my travels ever since, marked up as it is with my underlinings and marginal references to the Arabic that underlies the translation. A translation that gave me pause and perplexity at times. That Penis knew his translation would follow the original text, causing what he called a disconcerting impression upon most of its readers is clear, yet he felt it inevitable. He hoped that the disconcerting impression would only be an initial response to his work. Often, I found myself wishing Penis had explained in footnotes his choice of terms and construal of sentences more than he did. I asked him once why his translation lacked a more robust set of notes. He told me that Strauss had informed him the publishers felt the manuscript could not financially bear the weight of additional annotation. A disappointing response, given the great benefit Penis's erudition would have brought to clarifying the text. Subsequently, I came to realize that Penis and Strauss deliberately chose to offer a translation with a minimum of textual annotations and contextual clarifications. They did so presumably out of a sense of loyalty to the Rambam's wishes to let the guide speak for itself, each reader expected to react to it in proportion to his or her philosophical sophistication. The lengthy introductions both Strauss and Penis contributed to the book could suffice to orient the reader to its subtleties. Is that right? Subtleties, that's it. To its subtleties. So they thought that the contributions would suffice for that, without their having to reveal the guide's essential message. Penis's translation was intended then to be as objective as possible, free from tendentious readings, an accurate rendition in English of a medieval Judeo-Arabic text. The technical terms would be offered as Maimonides would have wished to present them, in language that his readers would have recognized, if in varying degrees of comprehension. The translation as a whole accomplishes this goal brilliantly and has contributed greatly to the increased scholarship on the guide. At the same time, the translation has not made the guide more accessible or more popular with the wider reading public. This is probably due to the demands of the text, demands both stylistic and substantive, as well as to the lack of a readership equipped to appreciate its exegetical and philosophical subtleties. This, too, Penis foresaw. In an odd way, it may be said
that the translation is not entirely free of privileging a certain reading of the guide. This is probably inevitable, despite the splendid achievement that Pinus wrought, in that every translation is an interpretation. Pinus's interpretation is to present Maimonides' God and his relation to the world in personal terms, even as Maimonides insisted his God had no affect. Believing that, Maimonides yet wrote in a way that gave God the appearance of personality, and Pinus translates Maimonides accordingly, making no attempt to alert the reader to the dissimulating character of Maimonides' text. Pinus's translation thus keeps Maimonides' secret as he would have wished it kept, though not allowing the English reader full awareness of the ambiguity of the text. In what follows, I hope to give examples of this, beginning with minor stylistic issues. Every translator has to choose between literal and non-literal renditions of the original language. Pinus mostly follows the Arabic closely, with allowance for syntactic changes, but supplements it on occasion with an additional word or two to bring out Maimonides' obvious intention. These small modifications may be seen as essentially stylistic touches and are mostly innocuous, evidence of Pinus's masterly control of his source language. At the same time, they give the English reader of the guide a particular way to read the book, with little opportunity to consider alternative readings. Consider, for example, Pinus's translation of Al-Hayarat. In Guide 2.4, Maimonides is said to exclaim on the good effects, Al-Hayarat, that necessarily result from the circular motion of a celestial body. In Guide 2.11, however, Al-Hayarat is given as good things in the sentence, quote, from the benefits received by the separate intellects, good things and lights, Hayarat wal-anwar, overflow to the bodies of the spheres, and from the spheres, forces and good things, Kuwan wa Hayarat, overflow to this body. Pinus continues treating Chayar as a good thing in the beginning of the next sentence, when Maimonides writes, and this is number 1 of the handout, Wa'ilам anakulu mufidin chayrun ma fi hadha tartib. Well, this could be rendered simply as, know that everything in this order that emanates some good. Pinus fills out the sentence as, know that in the case of every being that causes a certain good thing to overflow from it according to this order of rank. Here, stylistic concerns to flesh out Maimonides' intentions merge with Pinus's tendency, as we shall see, to avoid using nominal or verbal forms of the term emanation, and with his tendency to treat Maimonides' adoption of the indefinite pronoun ma as denoting a specific or definite object. On rare occasions, Pinus comments on his translation. Sometimes, however, his comment could use further comment. For example, in Guide 2.11, which is number 2 on the handout, he comments on his choice of ignorant in the sentence, quote, when the wicked from among the ignorant communities, Shiraru Milal Jahaliya, ruin their good qualities, etc. His note 13 there points out that ignorant is semantically correct, as Jahiliya derives from the verb jahila, to be ignorant, and that it is, quote, applied ordinarily to the pre-Islamic Arabs because of their paganism, end quote. Pinus then says that Maimonides, quote, did not wish to suppress this shade of meaning, end quote, further on in this chapter, but the quotation Maimonides brings from Isaiah 29:14, and the wisdom of their wise men shall perish, and the understanding of their prudent men shall be hid, oblige Pinus to prefer ignorant to another term, quote, even though it does not render an essential element of the meaning, end quote. What is the essential element to which Pinus is referring? I suggest it is the association of the word Jahiliya with pagan Arabs, and by extension with the Arab Ummah. Maimonides is likely casting aspersions upon Islam, and Pinus's note may be seen as a discreet nod to this notion, not elaborating upon it. An example of an ambiguous choice is Pinus's translation of passion for infial in the sentence which is number 3 in the handout. In the sentence in Guide 3.52, which he renders as, quote, he may he be exalted, has explained that the end of the actions prescribed by the whole law is to bring about the passion, husul hadal infial, of which it is correct that it be brought about. Infial would ordinarily be translated as affect, which has a more neutral and scientific ring to it. Presumably, penis shows passion rather than affect due to the emotions of fear and awe of God that Maimonides would have followed the perfect person's observance of the law. This, though, conveys a sense of ecstasy and rapture, which Maimonides does not emphasize elsewhere in the guide as the culminating existential moment of perfection. Of course, the passion of penis approximates affect in its Latin affinity to passivity, but that would have been misleading to the average reader. Penis's passion thus alludes to the emotional effects of perfect knowledge and actions Maimonides may or may not have wished to convey. On occasion, Penis's choice of words may seem too literal and unfamiliar. At Guide 110, Maimonides associates the appearance and disappearance of the Shekhinah with the biblical terms of descent and ascent, respectively.
Sorry about that.
It's all right. As Penis indicates in a note, Maimonides uses the Arabic sakina for the equivalent Hebrew Shekhinah. Penis, however, chooses to use indwelling with the aforementioned note. He doesn't thereby explain what or who the Shekhinah is, let alone the indwelling. Maimonides would have expected his readers, then as now, to be familiar with the concept of the Shekhinah, however amorphous it was and is. It has been commonly associated with the immanent presence of the divine, its personal aspect often highlighted as expressing the feminine, compassionate side of the deity. Penis may have thought Maimonides would not have wanted to encourage such unphilosophical associations with the term, personalizing God's presence unduly. Penis thus introduced an artificial term, a neologism, in translating the Shekhinah as indwelling, thereby bringing attention to a theory of providence Maimonides had yet to develop in the guide. Perhaps Penis used the Arabic form of sakina rather than the Hebrew Shekhinah for this reason, to alert his specially attuned readers to his equivocal use of the term. Penis's choice of indwelling resonates well with Maimonides' reference a few sentences later to calamities that occur, quote, in accordance with God's pre-eternal will, b'chasbi mashiatihi al-kadim. Here, Penis follows his source literally, though it would have helped the average reader to explain what Maimonides meant by a pre-eternal will, as opposed to simply an eternal will. As Maimonides elaborates, all divine descents are part of an eternal plan, or even a pre-eternal plan, referring to a will that preceded creation. He says, quote, man is too insignificant to have his actions visited and to be punished for them were it not for the pre-eternal will, unquote. Actually, Maimonides ends his sentence saying, were it not for the will, Penis tacking on pre-eternal. He thereby draws attention to Maimonides' view of the eternal nature of God's will, which has never changed, being present before creation. Though the sentence just read would seem to indicate a predestined particular fate for every individual, it does not necessarily imply that, as we shall see, and Penis's translation here assists in alerting us to Maimonides' philosophical dressing of biblical figures of speech. In his discussion of divine providence in Guide 317, Maimonides employs some of the same terms and ideas we have just been looking at. In the fifth view of providence expressed, Maimonides offers the opinion of our law, with which he claims to agree. Thus he says that God's will that animals and humans move by means of their own will, as does man, and that man has free choice as well, stems, quote, from his eternal volition in the eternity apartiante, min mashiatihi al-kadimati filazim. Maimonides has here doubled down on the notion of a pre-creation eternal will, using both kadima and azal to convey the idea. It is God's eternal will that had already and always established and determined the rules of the game for the created world, what could and would happen to people consequent upon their actions. Kulu dhalika, all the fortunate and unfortunate things that happen to an individual or group, Maimonides says, occur al-najiyati al-istihkak, in accordance with that which is deserved. As before, Penis translates this phrase as having every event, quote, determined according to the deserts of the men concerned, introducing determination into the sentence, as well as making God appear to act in an ad hominem manner. Pinus reinforces the impression of God's partiality in the following paragraph, when Maimonides offers examples of actions that men interpret as divine punishments or rewards, but which occur simply bi'istichkach, a term that Pinus translates according to his deserts, or which could be, quote, quote, according to that which is deserved. And again, a bit later in the chapter, number 4 of the handout, Pinus has Maimonides say that the calamities that people suffer at sea or at home are, quote, not due to chance, but to divine will in accordance with the deserts of those people. For which latter phrase, in accordance with that which is deserved, is arguably preferable. Pinus's understanding that Maimonides was a determinist is to be found in other places in the Guide as well. In Guide 320, Maimonides says that God's knowledge is unchanging and unitary, encompassing future contingent events. As Pinus translates, number 5 in the handout, quote, foreseeing that God knows that a certain man is now non-existent but will exist at a certain time, will go on existing for such and such a duration, and will then become non-existent, there will be for him no additional knowledge when that individual comes into existence as he had known beforehand. Pinus has Maimonides assert God's prior knowledge of particulars by rendering the Arabic fulan as, quote, a certain man, instead of the more indeterminate someone. Pinus's choice would seem to be strengthened by the end of the sentence, however, when God is said to acquire no additional knowledge when that individual comes to existence as he had known beforehand. So Pinus, translating the Arabic, فَإِنَّ إِذَا وُجِدَ ذَلِكَ الشَّخْصُ كَمَا تَقَدَّمَ الْعِلْمُ بِهِ. This sentence could, though, as well be given as saying that no additional divine knowledge is acquired, quote, whenever that individual exists like that of whom there was prior knowledge, quote. That is, Maimonides is acknowledging that God knows all the ways future contingencies may become realized and become necessary, so that whenever one such occurs, he may be said to have known it already. Maimonides makes this very point later in the chapter when he explicitly says that God's knowledge of the actualization of future possibilities does not deprive them of their possible status. Again, Pinus writes of a certain possible thing when the Arabic is mumkin ma, some possible thing. Maimonides is saying that God in his eternal unchanging knowledge knows that possible things as truly possible will be realized, their modal status then changing from possible to necessary. Not related to temporality, God does not know when that will happen or which real possibility will then be realized, but whichever and whenever, he may be said to have known it theoretically always, not tampering with its contingent status. That is the point of Maimonides' closing remark here, that it is, quote, one of the fundamental principles of the law of Moses, the basis of the whole of religious legislation, the commandments and the prohibitions, that God's knowledge concerning what will happen does not make this possible thing quit its nature. My alternative readings of Maimonides to those offered by Pinus are induced by the Rambam's concept of God's eternal and unchanging being, which conflates his knowledge and will. Excuse me. Therefore, he cannot know changing contingent beings as such, and Maimonides' attempts to make it seem possible only disqualify him as a philosopher and identify him with the Mutikalimun whom he despised. His desired commitment was to philosophy, with all the reservations he expressed. Pinus's translation at times blurs this commitment deliberately. Pinus's translation choices in Maimonides' presentation of Creatio ex nihilo in Guide 213 are also noteworthy. The first opinion given, which is the opinion of, quote, all who believe in the law of Moses, is that before God created the world, it was, quote, purely and absolutely non-existent. Pinus choosing non-existent to translate Adam, which is literally privation. Afterwards, Thumma, Maimonides writes in Pinus's translation, God volitionally, quote, brought into existence, Aujada, out of nothing, all the beings as they are, including time. Pinus's out of nothing translates La min shaya, which is literally not from a thing. The second opinion that Maimonides presents is that of, quote, all the philosophers who say, as Pinus translates, it is absurd, min al-mahal, that God would bring a thing into existence out of nothing, min la shaya.
and it is likewise not possible that a thing should pass away into nothing, illa la. Reiterating his position, Maimonides writes that the philosophers believe it impossible that a hylomorphic being can be generated out of the absolute non-existence, adamach, of that matter, or that it should pass away into the absolute non-existence of that matter. In this last remark, Pinus maintains his earlier preference for translating Adam as non-existence rather than privation. He continues this locution at the end of the chapter when Maimonides summarizes his position. The paragraph reads, and this is handout number 6, quote, "For the purpose of every follower of the law of Moses and Abraham our father, or of those who go the way of these two, is to believe that there is nothing eternal, in any way at all existing simultaneously with God. To believe also that the bringing into existence of a being out of non-existence, Ijadul Mawjudin min Adam, is for the deity not an impossibility and mumtana, but rather an obligation, wajib." This last sentence of Maimonides may furnish a clue why Pinus chose to translate Adam as non-existence rather than privation. The absurdity and impossibility of generating a being from nothing are logical evaluations that are more transparent with the term privation, which in itself begs the existence of an actual existing object. It is for that reason also that the philosopher's deity is obliged to bring the privation of something into existence, since it is a possible reality, and all true possibilities must be actualized at some time. The philosophers, of course, deny the possibility of an absolute privation, which for them is a logical absurdity, something that is less apparent, perhaps, in the more metaphysically attuned, quote, absolute non-existence. Given that Maimonides is aware of this, and that he would have approved of the manner in which Pinus presented the matter, did Maimonides also intend to signify that the Jewish view of an original state of, quote, pure and absolute privation, which Pinus gives as non-existence, also makes no sense? In the passages read, Pinus translates both Lamin Shai and Milah Shai as out of nothing, rather than respectively not from a thing and from no thing. As seen, he also translates Laisathum Mashayim Kadimun as there is nothing eternal, rather than no eternal thing is there. Though the alternatives mentioned are less felicitous, they do hint to Maimonides' understanding that God did not create the world out of absolute nothingness, since the forms of the world had to have been in his mind eternally, but rather without prior existing material things. Pinus' translation here thus reinforces conviction that Maimonides wanted to present his view of creation in a conventional manner that would shield it from unsuspecting eyes. That impression is foreshadowed in Guide 128, when Maimonides interprets the revelation at Sinai described in Exodus 24:10 as a parable depicting the creation of God of first matter. God being, according to Pinus, its creator ex nihilo. That is how Pinus translates mubdi, though he notes that mubdi, while generally connoting a creator ex nihilo, is less explicit than this Latin English expression. Indeed it is, for it is used by Avicenna and others simply to denote an originator, a deity who does not necessarily create from nothing. Pinus has interpreted Maimonides as wishing to present creation, at least exoterically, as being from nothing, and fastens on this term to do that. A third example of this is Pinus' translation of forms of ikhtiyar as free choice, rather than as simply choice. Thus in Guide 219, Maimonides summarizes Aristotle's doctrine of the necessity that governs an eternal world in saying, as Pinus translates, accordingly, nothing has come into being in virtue of the purpose of one possessing purpose who chose freely and willed that all things should be as they are. The Arabic for chose freely is simply ikhtira, chose. But Maimonides has in this case given Pinus ample justification for adding freely, in that Maimonides is contrasting Aristotle's God and his on this very point, namely that the Greek God acts on necessity without free choice, while the God of Israel chooses volitionally, presumably by his free will. In Guide 221, Pinus vacillates in his translation of this term. In the opening sentence, Pinus summarizes the views on eternity of the latter-day philosophers, al-Mutaakhirin al-Falasifa, notably Avicenna and Al-Farabi. They assert, Maimonides writes, that God is, quote, the agent of the world, who chose that it should exist, purposed it, and particularized it. فاعل العالم ومختار وجوده وقصده ومخصصه. Thus, Venus renders Mukhtar here as chose, and with the next opportunity he again modifies the choice as free. As Maimonides is said to say, these philosophers claim, quote, there is no difference between your saying, an agent, one who wills, one who purposes, one who chooses freely, and one who particularizes. And again, in reiterating the Aristotelian supposed position that conflates necessity and free choice, Maimonides is rendered as saying that the meaning of Aristotle's assertion of the necessary and perpetual causation of the world, quote, is the same as what is meant by his followers asserting that the world derives from the act of the deity or exists in virtue of his purpose, will, free choice, and particularization. Free choice being ikhtiyar in Arabic. Maimonides has correctly assessed his Muslim predecessors' attempts to combine will and necessity in God's governance of the world, though in the Neoplatonic tradition that they inherited, the world was not particularly free. If they did not resolve this antinomy, though, neither did Maimonides, at least not philosophically. He stresses repeatedly that God's will, as his knowledge and power, are not separate from his essence, and that that essence is unchanging and eternal, as we have seen. For Maimonides, then, God has always known what he intends to do, and he can never change that will without changing his being. His will, accordingly, is not free, not as we understand the term. He is, however, intent on claiming free choice for God, and Venus's translation encourages us to believe that is his real position. As mentioned, Venus frequently translates Maimonides' references to God by personifying the deity, notwithstanding Maimonides' declared theoretical position against such a conception. Venus presents this in small as well as large ways. Thus, at Guide 153, Maimonides says that the different acts of God, the different acts attributed to God, do not reflect different notions within his essence, but as Venus translates, all his different acts, may he be exalted, are all of them carried out by means of his essence. Venus has here rendered the phrase kuluhu bidatihi, which referring to the divine acts simply says that they are all in or related to his essence, by the phrase carried out by means of his essence. It is, of course, the instrumental be in bidatihi that allows Venus to fill out the sentence as he does, though carried out by means of his essence adds a touch of personification to God that Maimonides may or may not have intended. Similarly, in a number of places in the Guide, Venus has Maimonides say that God watches over his ordered creation. In Guide 159, God's governance of existing things is said to mean that he watches over their order, yahfuzul nidamaha, when it could as well be said that he preserves their order. Venus uses the phrase watching over regularly to express God's providence, even where the sentence lacks a necessary verb. Thus, in Guide 318, providence is repeatedly said to watch over prophets, righteous individuals, and the like, though the Arabic is less direct. This is number 7 in the handout. Venus, as Maimonides say, that when any human individual has obtained, because of the disposition of his matter and his training, a greater proportion of this overflow than others, providence will of necessity watch more carefully over him than over others. The Arabic of the latter part of the sentence reads simply, kanat alinayatu bihi aktaru ta'uhatan. Providence will necessarily be greater for him. So too the prophets are said to have a providence that is simply azima jiddan, very great, not watched over, as Venus has it. Venus continues this locution of watching over in Guide 351, where Maimonides explicitly ties providence to intellectual attainment. Once again, with the Arabic laconic saying that providence will be with him, takunu linayatu bihi, Venus has watches over. Later in the chapter, which is number 8 in the handout, Venus has Maimonides assert that God's providence is constantly watching over those who have obtained this overflow. وَتَكُونُ وِنَايَةُ اللَّهِ دَائِمَةً لِمَنْ خُسِرَ لَهُ ذَلِكَ الْفَيْء. In essence, this is a tautology. Maimonides is saying that God's providence is constantly bestowed upon those to whom it is bestowed, provided that they exert themselves to obtain it. By translating as he does, Venus emphasizes a volitional aspect in what is otherwise an automatic process. That is, the emanation that is constantly endowing the world with its forms particularly benefits those attuned to it. And this maximal amount of the omnipresent emanating forces is singled out as betokening God's watchful presence. Maimonides, however, probably will not have objected to this popularization of his understanding of providence for all the personalization and volitional attribution it brings to his image of God. As is known, the Neoplatonically inspired notion of emanation is from Maimonides, the mechanism through which God relates, indirectly for the most part, to the world. Five is the Arabic term for this, and its presence, mostly in verbal forms, is ubiquitous in the God. True to its etymological origins, five in its various constructions is given by Venus as overflow and overflowing. First mention of this term is in Guide 1-2, where Maimonides describes the intellect of pre-lapsarian man as one that, quote, God made overflow unto man. Al-aql alladhi afadahu Allahu al-insan. At Guide 146, Maimonides considers the actions and language ascribed to God in the Bible as, in effect, metaphors for divine emanation. As Venus translates, action and speech are ascribed to God, so that an overflow proceeding from him should thereby be indicated. At Guide 169, Maimonides writes in Venus's translation, quote, "For the universe exists in virtue of the existence of the Creator, and the latter continually endows it with a permanence in virtue of the thing, manner, that is spoken of as overflow." A fuller description of Fight's activity is found at Guide 212, where Maimonides writes, in number 9 in the handout, quote, "It has been said that the world derives from the overflow of God, killa an al-alama min faydillah, and that he has caused to overflow to it, annahu afada alayha, everything in it that is produced in time. In the same way it is said that he caused his knowledge to overflow to the prophets, innahu afada ilmahu ala al-anbiya, and it is his action that is called overflow." Venus is justified in calling fire overflow, for Maimonides says God himself is sometimes likened to an overflowing spring of water, an image supposedly of an action separate from matter. Not that the emanative process is purely immaterial, for as Maimonides says towards the end of this chapter, the material celestial spheres, as well as the separate intellects of the heavens, also act by overflowing. For all his mention of fire as the principal factor in the actions of God and celestial intelligence and spheres, Maimonides repeatedly alleges that he does not understand its meaning, and nowhere does he endorse the hypostatic intellect and soul of classical Neoplatonism. Translated as overflow, fire remains metaphorical but ill-defined, a popular term disguising its scientific and philosophical forebears. Towards the end of the Guide, 351, Venus again interprets Maimonides as personalizing a relation that essentially is not personal. It is the relation had by an individual's acquired intellect to the universal agent or active intellect at the time of a person's death. That relation is commonly called conjunction, itisal, and though Maimonides scarcely uses the term in the Guide, it is a key feature of his epistemology. The first appearance of a version of this term is found in the first chapter of the Guide, where Maimonides expounds on the unique feature of intellectual apprehension, al-idrak al-aqli, that which only human beings possess. He writes in number 10 of the handout, "It was because of this something, because of the divine intellect conjoined with man, in ajli hadal mana and in ajli al-aqli al-ilahi al-mutasim bihi, that it is said of the latter that he is in the image of God and in his likeness." In Guide 168, Maimonides expands his description of intellectual apprehension. He does not speak of conjunction per se, but it is the activity described, that of joining of subject and object in cognition. As Venus translates, quote, "For in the case of every intellect, its act is identical in essence, filuhu hu adatuhu," literally its act is its essence. For the true reality and liquidity of the intellect is apprehension. In concluding this explanation, Maimonides says that the numerical unity of the intellect, intellectually cognizing subject, and the intellectually cognized object, does not hold good with reference to the Creator only, but also with reference to every intellect. Thus, in us too, yes, not in you too, in us too. The intellectually cognizing subject, the intellect, and the intellectually cognized object are one and the same thing, shayun wachim. Wherever, which is a mistake for whenever, Arabic is mata, we have an intellect in action. In Guide 3.8, Maimonides, though not Venus, refers to conjunction by name, which is number 11 in the handout, which is mistakenly given as being 358. It's 3.8. Maimonides writes of those men who, quote, seek a state of perpetual permanence of Makar Daim and only reflect on the mental representation of an intelligible, on the grasp of a true opinion regarding everything, and on union with the divine intellect. Venus has here substituted union for conjunction, perhaps as a way of further distancing Maimonides from acknowledging his acceptance of a well-recognized doctrine, and instead having him speak in more general and for Maimonides less philosophical terms. The term for conjunction, itisal, is absent in the concluding chapters of the Guide, though its presence is felt strongly. In Guide 351, Maimonides uses the term soul and intellect interchangeably. He has not, however, provided any systematic description of the faculties of the soul as for the Vereres, nor any argument for or defense of the concept of an independent individual and immortal soul, as did Avicenna. Maimonides believed that the only faculty of the soul that survived death was the intellect, and that to the degree it achieved conjunction with the ancient intellect, the degree to which it participated in universal and eternal truth. That did not give the individual intellect individual immortality, however, and Maimonides says on 2 occasions that there is but one eternal intellect, that which contains all the forms on earth. Nevertheless, writing in a popular vein at the end of his book, in chapter 51, Maimonides conflates intellect and soul. Thus he first says that, quote, as the fire of the desires is quenched, the intellect is strengthened, its lights achieve a wider extension, its apprehension is purified, and it rejoices in what it apprehends. End quote. Then when an old and perfect man approaches death, his apprehensions and joy become greater and transform into, quote, a great love for the object of apprehension, that is God, until the soul is separated from the body at that moment in this state of pleasure. Concluding the chapter, Maimonides writes, as Venus has it, number 12 in the handout, after having reached this condition of enduring permanence, that intellect remains in one and the same state, the impediment that sometimes screened him off having been removed, and he will remain permanently in that state of intense pleasure, which does not belong to the genus of bodily pleasures. In so rendering it, Venus has chosen to treat the subject of the sentence as a person, rather than as the person's intellect. A closer reading would provide, or could provide, quote, after this, that intellect, dalitalaka, will remain permanently in one state, since the impediment that sometimes obscured it, has been lifted, and it will remain permanently, in that state of intense pleasure, etc. This is the poetic description of the anticipated bliss that Maimonides envisaged conjunction between the intellect that joined with the ancient intellect, even though qua intellect there is no emotional dimension to conjunction. It is the person while alive whose soul imagines the delight to be had in conjunction, the experience itself being purely intellectual, particularly after the demise of the soul. Nevertheless, Venus chooses to translate Maimonides in such a way as to personalize conjunction, as he does with emanation. He clearly felt that is what Maimonides would have wanted, and that as translator, his primary obligation was towards respecting the author and not his readers. Can we, ought we, to do otherwise? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ivry, and we now have our third speaker, Professor Sarah Stroumsa from Ivry University.
Thank you. Being the third in this panel, I discover with great pleasure that there are some points on which all three of us agree, and I just want to make it explicit that we didn't have a tawato before, we didn't agree on what we say beforehand, and I hope that you will agree with me that two are better than one, and the triple chord is even better. When Shlomo translation of the guide was first published, also published with it, was the translator's introduction. And indeed, it is this combined publication that the present conference celebrates. As translators' introductions go, this is a peculiar one, since it says practically nothing about the translation. In vain will we look for an exposition of the language and style of the translated Judeo-Arabic text, or of the style and method chosen for the English translation. Instead, most of the introduction is dedicated to, I quote, indications which may prove helpful concerning Maimonides' philosophic sources, his evaluation of them, and the way in which he utilizes them. A Hebrew translation of Pinus's introduction appeared in 1977 as an article independent of the translation and was fittingly titled The Philosophical Sources of the Guide for the Perplexed, with only a note referring the reader to the original context in which this essay first appeared. Moreover, even simple technical notes which one would expect to find in a translator's introduction, such as a note on the translation of biblical verses, did they follow one of the many English translations available at the time, or were they translated by Pinus himself? Even these are conspicuously absent from the introduction. Only a few sentences on the first page of the introduction tell us in a somewhat roundabout way what Pinus considered to be typical of the style of the guide. Juxtaposing Maimonides' systematic, lucid, and authoritative legal code to his often dislocated and broken up guide, written some 20 years later, Pinus remarks that Maimonides, I quote, had not lost his gift for lucid exposition, and he adds, indeed, this gift is brilliantly displayed in certain passages of the guide. Pinus further says that the disconcerting impression that the peculiar method used by Maimonides in the guide is apt to produce at first upon most of its readers was certainly aimed at by Maimonides. His book's impact depends upon it. One would have expected the translator to say whether he sees it as his task to follow Maimonides' peculiar method, or rather to emulate Maimonides' gift for lucid exposition by translating Maimonides' ideas into a clear and accessible English. But neither these tasks nor any other are spelled out in the introduction. A peephole into the difficulties of translating the guide, as well as of the choices made by the translator, was opened through Pinus's correspondence with Leo Strauss, parts of which were published in 1998 by Joel Kramer and Joseph Stern. As this correspondence shows, Pinus made a deliberate decision to translate every Arabic technical term by one and the same English term. According to Kramer and Stern, this decision allowed Pinus to keep the nuances of meaning in the guide, which Maimonides used as the directives to the discerning reader. This decision also seems to have meant that Pinus ignored Maimonides' own advice to Samuel ibn Tibbon. Maimonides' instruction to Ibn Tibbon necessarily would have meant explicating the esoteric part of the guide. And since Ibn Tibbon spontaneously, in Pinus's words, decided to preserve in his translation the esoteric aspect, he, Ibn Tibbon, thus acted contrary to Maimonides' explicit or exoteric instruction, and, say Stern and Kramer, Pinus follows Ibn Tibbon, not Maimonides, in his own method of translation. As Kramer and Stern convincingly argue, Pinus had a clear notion of his method of translation, a method that he was following consistently. Pinus consciously adopted Ibn Tibbon's fidelity to the peculiar syntax of the guide, and in his translation, syntax and terminology were rather rigidly translated. Stern and Kramer qualify Maimonides' style as loose. In this, they follow Herbert Davidson, who speaks of the loose syntax typical of the guide, or the loose and choppy style characteristic of the guide. Maimonides' syntax is indeed often anacolutic, as is common in Middle Arabic in general and in Judeo-Arabic in particular. And like other philosophers, his syntax certainly deviates from what is taught by textbooks of classical Arabic. But it is anything but loose. Just like its terminological and lexical precision, noted by Strauss when he speaks of a book as carefully worded as the guide, and like its intricate but thought-out structure, the syntax of the guide is measured and calculated to direct the reader according to his, and Maimonides would probably not bother to add, or her, capacity. The treatment of the guide's syntax as loose ignores Maimonides' use of changing styles as a tool for the same purpose. From Pinus's correspondence with Strauss, it appears that Strauss had been aiming at achieving a uniform translation as far as possible, and also that he had encouraged Pinus to adopt a literal translation, an injunction that at some point Strauss had felt Pinus was following too literally. In the published letter, Pinus asks Strauss for clear directives as to the method to be employed. Strauss's response is unfortunately not available to us, but whatever this response may have been, Pinus was a person who at the end did what he understood to be right. I assume that this was also in the present case. Despite his uneven status vis-à-vis Strauss, a status that followed from the context of a commissioned translation and which emerges clearly from the published letter. The English-Arabic glossary provided by Pinus at the end of the translation also confirms that Pinus indeed adopted a rigid translation of the terminology, where every English term almost always translates the same Arabic word. Notwithstanding Friedlander's translation, published some 2 decades previously, Pinus's English translation of the guide into English has been a watershed in introducing Maimonides to the world of scholars of medieval Islamic philosophy. Its publication in 1963 coincided with the beginning of momentous transformations in the academic world. The consolidation of English as the universal academic language on the one hand, the beginning of the dramatic expansion of higher education on the other. In this context, the new English translation offered by Pinus was, and perhaps remains to this day, the single most effective vehicle of introducing Maimonides to scholars and to students of medieval Islamic philosophy. Nevertheless, over the years, users of the translation have occasionally and perhaps growingly expressed reservations regarding the style of this translation. More often than not, the criticism is not published or written, out of respect to Pinus's stature, out of appreciation of the overall authority of translation, or for whatever other reason. But many of us have had the opportunity to hear reservations concerning the translation of this or that passage, and more generally concerning the present value of the translation. Quite often, the criticism leveled against Pinus's translation targets precisely his uniform, somewhat literal translation, and the fact that he kept the same word for the same term, thus creating what critics regard as stiff, archaic, or inelegant translation. At the outset, it should be said that of course no translation is free of faults, and Pinus's translation is no exception. Furthermore, it is only natural that half a century after its publication, any faithful reader of this translation will have accumulated a list of his or her own suggested corrections to it. The question at this point is therefore not whether the translation is faultless, but whether it is still worth consulting. For Maimonidean scholars, this too can be said from the outset, notwithstanding the other valuable translations available, Ibn Tibbon's, Solomon Munk's, Michael Schwartz's. Pinus's English translation is still indispensable. This is not only because of Pinus's unquestionable erudition and understanding of medieval Arabic philosophy in general and of Maimonides' philosophy in particular, which are reflected in the translation. As I will try to show now, it is precisely Pinus's above-mentioned terminological rigidity which, rather than a weakness, is a veritable asset. In order to demonstrate this claim, I wish to revisit the question that was most hotly debated in the last years of Pinus's life and in the decade following his death, namely the human possibility to attain knowledge of metaphysical realities. This philosophical problem is already noted briefly but quite clearly in Pinus's introduction to his translation of the Guide, where Pinus explicitly says that we are faced in Maimonides' text with a fundamental ambiguity. Indeed, it is often the case that going back to Pinus's introduction, one finds in it ensconced in a few sentences the insights that Pinus was to develop and expound upon in later publications. But the debate in question started in earnest only after the publication in 1979 of Pinus's article on the limitations of human knowledge according to Al-Farabi, Ibn Bajjah, and Maimonides. In this article, Pinus grappled with what he regarded as a fundamental and perplexing problem presented by the Guide, namely the irreconcilable contradictions between the narrow limits Maimonides sets to human knowledge and his affirmation that man's ultimate goal and felicity consist in knowledge and contemplation. Pinus endeavored to show, and here is a list of quotations, to show that this contradiction need not remain unresolved, and to resolve it by putting forward some very bold assertions. He argued that according to Maimonides, the intellection of the immaterial entities and of the union with them are impossible for man, that Maimonides held an agnostic position with regard to the thesis of the permanence of the intellect, that it is on the face of it unlikely that the immortality of the intellect, which in the judgment of Maimonides of the Guide is an obscure and problematic matter, should be considered by him as the goal of the human individual, that apprehension of God may, in view of the limitations of human mind, be equated with the knowledge of God's governance, and finally, that for Maimonides, the practical way of life is superior to the theoretical. In putting forward these assertions and in the analysis that led to them, Pinus relied heavily on reports regarding Al-Farabi's lost commentary on Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, as well as on a hitherto unpublished text by Ibn Bajjah. Since then, the publication of Ibn Bajjah's text and its analysis by several scholars corrected it in ways that made it unsupportive of Pinus's argument. Nevertheless, the essential question asked by Pinus regarding the seemingly irreconcilable contradiction in the Guide remains. The fiercest response to these claims came from Davidson, for whom Pinus's article turned the Guide into, I quote, the most bizarre work in the history of philosophy, a 450-page book written with the purpose of concealing a handful of remarks that, sotto voce, undermine virtually everything the book says, end of quote. Davidson contested the accuracy of Pinus's reading of Al-Farabi and Ibn Bajjah, as well as Maimonides' dependence upon them, which he regarded as at best conjectural. But his main critique addressed Pinus's esoteric reading of the guide. For Davidson, in ascertaining an author's intent, even an author who indulges in esoteric expression, the starting point should be what he himself says. The guide, therefore, like any other philosophical book, must be taken seriously to say what it means. And therefore, if Maimonides says that human goal is the achievement of knowledge, then he must consider this knowledge attainable to humans. Davidson reviews 7 passages in the guide which have been discussed by Pinus and concludes that if we respect Maimonides' words and refrain from interpreting them as perversely meaning the opposite of what he says, the passages fall into a comfortable and consistent pattern. End of quote. Pinus's question revealed indeed a fundamental ambivalence in the guide, an ambivalence that Davidson's response, seeking to establish a comfortable pattern, does not fully recognize. At the same time, Pinus's attempt to resolve this ambivalence fails to accept what I consider to be its inherently unresolvable nature. As I've argued elsewhere, the goal which philosophers like Maimonides set for themselves, apprehending the highest metaphysical truths, was an immensely daunting one. Their observations and teaching indicated to them that the attachment of the human intellect to the body is a constant defining humanity just as much as the ultimate intellectual human goal defines it. The examination of previous philosophical texts and rationalist analysis led the philosophers to adhere to the theory that allowed for some sort of immortality achieved through the conjunction with a separate immaterial intellect, and they usually displayed confidence in humans' intellectual ability to achieve this goal. Nevertheless, it is only natural that they would at times lose heart and lapse into skepticism. Their statements about the possibility of immortality, therefore, vary in intensity and sometimes even in content. These fluctuations are not due to what Paul Vane had called, following Michel Foucault, tout système de vérité, nor does it reflect a double truth of the kind attributed to Averroes. In Maimonides' attitude to immortality, the two systems of truth, the religious and the philosophic, were agreed as far as people like him belonging to the philosophical elite were concerned. The ambivalence regarding immortality that Pinus detected in the guide faithfully reflects a fluctuating confidence, which I consider more psychological than theoretical. It would therefore be incorrect, in my view, to weigh Maimonides' statements on this particular issue against each other in search for his single true belief, which would be reflected by one statement as opposed to another statement which would be only a camouflage. It is remarkable that while Pinus's articles attempted to push Maimonides to one side of the ambivalence, his translation gracefully and subtly follows the pendulum of Maimonides' thought in this respect. Without abandoning his method that aimed at a uniform and constant translation of technical terms, Pinus follows in his translation the changing mood of the guide in ways that convey fully and with precision the different philosophical stress of each chapter. The guide's usually even and measured style changes at times abruptly, moving to exclamations, to direct address to the reader, such as "know that" or "you should know that," or to more poetic style. Such sudden changes serve as pointers, awakening the reader to the importance of the passage or highlighting the need to read it carefully, with an eye to a central or withheld truth that it may contain. Furthermore, there are several passages in the guide that, although not belonging strictly to the genre of poetry, can surely be described as poetic, where the metaphorical, elated prose seeks to convey exalted state of mind. Pinus's sensitive English translation is attuned to the calculated shifts in Maimonides' style. The more literary parts of the guide belong to this category of passages that mark a change in the flow of the guide's usual style. In the translation of these literary passages, Pinus's sensitivity to the guide's shifting mood is evident. At the same time, one is struck by his fidelity to Maimonides' vocabulary on the one hand, and to his own methodical principle in the translation on the other. For instance, Pinus cites the lightning simile in his aforementioned controversial article. He notes Maimonides' probable indebtedness to Avicenna's Isharat and the Sufi overtones in Avicenna's terminology. He also notes Maimonides' possible indebtedness to Ibn Bajjah. His own translation of the passage accordingly reflects these sources, and the English text rings with the same Sufi overtones. At no point, however, is Pinus carried away by the poetics of the translated text so as to forget the uniform terminological translation he adopted. Thus, the most frequent epistemological term used by Maimonides in the lightning simile, lawaha, is translated by Pinus as flashes or flashing. But when Maimonides introduces into the same poetic text the technical term of idrak, Pinus faithfully renders it by his own technical translation, apprehension. Another example is Guide 351, with the parable of the king in his palace and Maimonides' explanation of the Midrashic image of death through God's kiss. Pinus mentions this last passage as the only passage in the guide which contains an apparently unambiguous affirmation of the survival of the intellect, while Davidson, on his side, notes that Maimonides' language here falls short of technical precision. Falls short, however, does not strike me as a fair description of what must have been Maimonides' conscious change of style in order to expand on his perception of the hereafter, a change of style which, just like the heading "A Call to Attention" can be in the middle of this chapter, serves as a pointer to the importance of this passage. For Pinus, the change of style highlights Maimonides' ambivalence in this chapter. For Davidson, it seems to be of negligible importance. I agree with Pinus that the change is too remarkable to be ignored, but I share with Davidson the view that if the style of the text is significant, then what it says is also of primary importance. Borrowing terminology used by Pinus in the same article, we can distinguish in Maimonides' guide between epistemological sections, where he follows Aristotelian epistemology more closely, and parabolic, or in Pinus's terminology, metaphysical sections, which lack semantic rigor. In the epistemological sections, a central term that appears repeatedly is apprehension, idrak. We can distinguish different kinds of section even within the same chapter 351. This chapter is peppered with 29 occurrences of derivatives of adraka, but they are not evenly distributed in the chapter. In the more parabolic or metaphysical sections of the chapter, this term is less prominent and sometimes altogether absent. And the same phenomenon can be detected in other such sections of the guide as the lightning simile. Pinus argued that from the appearance of this term in the last chapter of the guide, 354, I quote, "It is evident that idrak of God does not mean an intellectual act that brings about the identity of the subject and object of intellection. The meaning of the term is much weaker," end of quote. In translating the guide, however, Pinus adhered to the uniformity of translation, preserving the word apprehension in the parabolic sections as elsewhere. For example, we hear that Moses, I quote, "For his great joy in that which he apprehended, he did neither eat bread nor drink water." Maimonides expresses the joy of illumination with the term irtibat, a figurative term which rings with Sufi and Abyssinian overtones. But Maimonides, immediately checks the exuberance with the more semantically rigorous Aristotelian adraka. Pinus unfailingly keeps to Maimonides' pace, changing registers as drastically and as often as Maimonides does, and so we get "for his great joy in that which he apprehended." As a result of this rigorous method, Pinus's translation allows us to verify and at times to criticize Pinus's own analysis. Regarding the possibility of attaining metaphysical knowledge, I believe that Pinus's translation allows us to see where both Pinus and Davidson try to erase Maimonides' ambivalence. As a translator, Pinus followed the most scrupulous scientific standards, whereby it should be possible to repeat the experiment so that others can verify it. Indeed, Pinus demonstrated this scientific detachment throughout his work. As many will recall, he often concluded his lectures by the following sentence or something similar: "Further research will confirm or disprove the results offered here." His translation of the guide gives the readers the tools necessary to conduct such further research. As mentioned above, with the passing of time, Pinus's translation of the guide is sometimes censored for what its critics regard as inelegant rigidity. I have attempted to show here that precision rather than rigidity is what characterizes this translation. Maimonides was not a poet, and his attitude to poetry was on the whole ambivalent at best. But he had a soft point for poets like his favorite disciple Joseph Ibn Shimon, who put their pen at the service of the philosophical quest. On rare but significant occasions, he himself indulged in such poetry, choosing to open and conclude the guide with short Hebrew verses. Furthermore, there are several passages in the guide that, although not belonging strictly to the genre of poetry, can surely be described as poetic, where the metaphorical, elated prose seeks to convey exalted state of mind. Pinus' sensitive English translation is attuned to the calculated shifts in Maimonides' style. Significantly, Pinus's translation includes both the opening and concluding verses of the guide as compared to the first edition of Schwarz's Hebrew translation, which omitted the opening verses, reflecting perhaps some skepticism prevalent at the time regarding Maimonides' authorship of these verses. Pinus, on his side, does not seem to have doubted that such poetic writings were as authentically Maimonidean as the more arid parts of the guide. Pinus took great care to follow Maimonides, the technical, scientific, and Aristotelian Maimonides, as well as the poetic, elated, and Sufi Maimonides, the Maimonides certain of the validity of the school's metaphysical tradition, as well as the disheartened Maimonides consumed by doubts. Pinus put forward his own bold conclusions in articles, but in the translation, respecting what he saw as Maimonides' gift for lucid exposition, Pinus seems to have stepped aside and attempted to let Maimonides speak without editing him, without presuming to create a more coherent and perhaps more elegant Maimonides. The resulting translation is endowed with the enduring elegance of precision and is therefore likely to remain indispensable for many years to come. In this, Pinus promises to join the League of Ibn Tibor. Thank you.
We thank you for listening to or viewing our podcast. For more information and for other podcasts, please see our website, divinity.uchicago.edu/podcasts. Copyright, the University of Chicago Divinity School.